hardest languages in the world and why they're not what you'd think. So generally when you hear people talking about the hardest languages in the world, you're looking at, so you can see these flags on the left, you've got Mandarin, Chinese, Russian, and Arabic. Generally they're kind of more typical hard languages. And whilst they are very difficult, they're not actually the hardest languages in the world. I'm going to tell you about this flag on the right and some of the other languages which are more difficult. They're just not spoken as commonly, which kind of does add to them being more difficult. So what makes a language hard? Let's get a few things out of the way straight away. There's two factors basically to answer this question. It is quite complex, but it just really boils down to two things. What are we considering hard? And then what languages are we considering? The second one's probably easy to answer. I've got that one on the next slide. But first of all, what is considered hard? The answer changes depending on what we're considering. If you're only considering how long it takes to learn the language, that's a very one-dimensional way of looking at it. If you're considering everything, as in not just how difficult it is, but also how accessible the learning is, there are languages that might be not too difficult to learn, but they're only spoken by small groups of people and they're not on the internet. So to learn it, you actually have to go there, which is obviously extremely inconvenient. And by the time you actually get there, you would have learned like Mandarin or something quicker. So it does depend on what we're considering hard. I'm actually going to answer this question in multiple ways and give you different answers depending on how you want to pose the question. I've got that on later slides, so we'll get to that. But this factor of the biggest real factor as far as hardness goes is how different the language is from the language you're learning from. So in the case of English, which is what we're all learning from, how different the language is from English, it's what's going to decide on how different it is. Obviously within that there's things like pronunciation, tone of voice, grammar rules, just general vocab, all these things. Those are going to make the language more different. So languages like, say, Dutch, Italian, and Spanish, anything that's more similar to English is going to be easier, and things that are more different, like Mandarin, Arabic, when not only do they have a completely different writing system, completely different words, completely different pronunciation, but like some languages like Arabic are literally written right to left instead of left to right. Things that are so different like that are going to be harder. And there are actually languages with even bigger differences compared to English than like Mandarin, Arabic, Russian, those languages. They're just not widely spoken. They use interesting ways of communicating. I'll get to that. But what can also make a language impossible is other variables, such as how accessible it is. I've already talked about that. We'll get into that, and that's going to be a big one for comparing which languages are actually harder. So we also need to remember what languages we're considering. So it's pretty hard to rank 7,000 known languages because like there's no one that can just list them all off the top of their head. There's not like a list A to Z of languages. There's tons of them. There's more than 7,000 as well. That's known. That's at a minimum. If we're considering just common languages, as in, it depends on your definition. If we just say 100 million people minimum, there's about 14, technically 15, but one of them doesn't really count. So it's pretty easy to rank those 14. It is still a matter of opinion, but that is doable. However, if you're going to rank every language ever, every language in existence, that's pretty hard. You might have to go group by group instead of individual languages, and then you can also rank languages that don't even exist anymore, and that just gets into beyond impossible territory because if people can't learn it, there's not really a way to rank it. You kind of have to guess a lot. You have to look at things that have evolved from that language and kind of go back, put it all together. It's a very multi-layered and complex question, but I will try to answer it, and the way I'm going to do that is by giving you multiple answers. So let's split it into two categories. So as far as common languages go, with 100 million plus speakers, that answer is more straightforward. It's still a matter of opinion, but I'm going to give you that one on the next slide. And then total languages, as in what is the hardest state, that is a tricky one. I'll do my best. So yeah, buckle up. With common, the 14 languages that I'm going to consider common languages are English, which doesn't count because it's the one we're talking. That wasn't the one I said doesn't count. That one I haven't even put in. But English, Mandarin, Hindi, Spanish, Modern Standard Arabic, which is the most common derivative of Arabic, French, Bengali, Russian, Portuguese, Urdu, Indonesian, Japanese, German, and Egyptian Arabic. It is debatable, but Mandarin, I don't speak it, but it's generally considered to be the most difficult due to a lot of things it has that just make it different from English. So it has over 10,000 characters. I think it has about 50. You only need a few thousand, I think, to read a newspaper and stuff like that. But there are a lot of basically letters. They're almost like pictures that have their own sounds and they can be combined to make words. That's how the language of Mandarin works. I've got a picture on the next slide I'll show you. But pronunciation and tones also makes it very difficult. Different ways to pronounce A certain word can have different meanings, which will obviously screw you up badly if you don't know how to pronounce them properly. And of course, it's not something we have in English, so it's going to be something you mess up. And overall, it's incredibly different from English. They're not even in the same overall family. English is Indo-European, Mandarin is Sino-Tibetan, so they're completely different. Arabic is also considered extremely difficult. So between Modern Standard Arabic and Egyptian Arabic, Modern Standard Arabic is considered harder. But overall, if you're just looking at Arabic languages, they're very difficult as well, because as far as writing goes, they're cursive and they're written right to left. So they're almost like they're written back to front. They're abjads, which means they don't have vowels. You only really write with consonants, and you can sometimes put vowel markings in. And overall, the pronunciation is weird. I do know the Arabic alphabet and a little bit of basic Arabic. It's pretty hard to pronounce some of it. And as far as grammar goes, with changing words, that kind of stuff, it's really frustrating as well. So Arabic is also incredibly difficult. Mandarin is generally considered to be harder, though. And just remember that languages do present unique challenges to each learner. So one person, or most people say, might think Mandarin is harder, but someone might just get the fact that you're writing with pictures, basically, and they might really struggle with Arabic and the writing right to left, especially if they struggle with writing in English, for example. They might find that impossible. So it really does depend on not just the languages we're looking at and the rules, but also the person looking at it is going to have a big impact. But yeah, Mandarin and Arabic are both extremely difficult. As far as those 14 languages go, Mandarin, both types of Arabic, Japanese is also going to be pretty hard because it's an Asian language. French, Portuguese, and German would probably be the easiest one. Spanish there? Yeah. Spanish, French, Portuguese, and German would be the easiest for there because they're more similar to English. And then anything more Asian, so you're looking at Urdu would be pretty difficult as well. I'm not sure about Indonesian. I don't know too much about that. Hindi is meant to be fairly difficult, but it is not on the level that Mandarin is. But anyway, so just up the top, you've got Chinese sentence. So as you can see, where you would have it in English, the lines are just matching up to where the word is in the sentence. So as you can see, it's not even in the same order. And then if you look down the bottom, I don't know what that says, so hopefully it doesn't say anything too bad. But it's just Arabic writing. It's right to left. And as you can see, it's mostly cursive joined together. It's quite difficult to read. I can sound it out without the vowels, but I don't know what it says. So I'm not going to read it to you. But yeah, it is quite a challenge. And then you've got currently existing. So this is a really hard category to break down because it has over 7,000 languages. But given that finding it, you don't need a teacher necessarily. If it's a really hard language, it's good to have someone to talk to about it. But we're looking for languages with extreme differences to English, and because these are not accessible on the internet, which I've said previously is the best tool for learning languages, basically, your best tool's taken away, so you kind of need some way of learning the language. So in some of these cases, you actually have to talk to someone because it's not written down or accessible in libraries or anything. The only way to learn it is to talk to someone from one of these small regional communities. So these kind of languages can be really hard. You'll find a lot of them throughout Africa, islands, indigenous peoples. So they're not documented too much, but I do have a few of them here, the hardest ones and the most interesting that I've found. So a lot of languages like Mandarin, English, and Arabic, for example, they're easy to access on the internet because of how important they are and how spoken they are, and they're also kind of modified to make it easier. So if you just think from a common sense perspective, if we discover something new that's never been found before on Earth or in space or whatever, gone are the days when countries just didn't have contact with each other. Now everything's accessible on the internet. There's just no point in really giving things wildly different names anymore, just from a common sense perspective. Like if we just found something new in space, there just isn't a reason not for everyone to name it the same thing. Obviously, pronunciation is going to be different when some languages are missing letters, but generally, as much as countries fight, there's just no point in making each other's lives hard, and that's why it's also easy for English people to learn Mandarin in comparison to some of these languages because there's so many tools accessible to do it. So, and they're obviously simplified for everyday use. There's simplified Chinese and traditional Chinese, for example, and English is simplified as well with, just look at how people text now. So some honourable mentions of hard languages include, overall, I've given the overall honourable mention to Silbo Gomero. This is not one that you've heard of, and it definitely wouldn't be the hardest language. It's definitely harder, but it probably has the hardest method of communication. So it's a language based on whistling. They don't actually talk. There's not one single word in the whole language. It uses different whistles to communicate. And because it's so loud, whistlers can actually communicate up to 5 kilometers apart, which is important on the island of, it's one of the Canary Islands it's from the native people there. They can actually communicate from up to 5 kilometers apart through the ravines and the mountains, and they can hear each other if they're proficient enough at it and actually talk, basically. They've actually proven this. There's like a BBC thing, and yeah, it is a proven thing that they can do. It was originally used by the Guanche people who were there. I don't know how to say that, but for their own language, but after colonization, when Spanish was introduced, they basically are talking Spanish, but they're just using the whistling to swap it out, which is why some people say it's not a real language, but try and learn it. Like, it is pretty difficult, and considering originally it was used for its own language, I'm going to count it. So it's so difficult because it uses no words. That's what makes it so different from English, because you're literally just whistling. So forget tones and forget pronunciation. You're not even speaking in this language. You're literally just whistling. And as you can see, there's a video you can look up of people trying to learn it. They're done for. Like, it's so hard to learn, basically. Obviously anything's doable, but as you can see, that's just the flag of the Canary Islands there, and that's someone doing it. So yeah, it's kind of like a whistle. You put your finger in your mouth and then you whistle. They have like sounds or sound combinations that match up to each consonant and vowel, and they can talk effectively. So that definitely gets the honourable mention. It's obviously not the hardest. There are other whistling languages, but this is one of the best known, and I just wanted to include it as an example of how different some languages are. And obviously you've got no shot at learning this without actually going there, basically. So a few other hard languages, just honourable mentions: Australian Aboriginal languages. This really goes down to the lack of teachers as well, because of how small the communities are that speak them because of past colonization. Navajo uses affixes, which is basically where you connect small, it's hard to explain, but you connect small words or letters onto a word to change it, and they use this a lot, which makes it very difficult. And Greenlandic is meant to be especially difficult. There's obviously tons of languages. I went down a rabbit hole of researching. I can't include all of them, but these are a few that are really difficult. For this category 2 of every language, I can't actually give you one answer, but I can just talk about a few of the different types of languages and what makes them so difficult. Like, particularly this one I think is interesting, just so you can get an idea of how it's almost impossible to compare them. So in closing, there's really too many languages to both current and extinct. We didn't even go into extinct languages. There's not really much point going there. You can read about it if you want, but it's impossible to compare them. There's too many to logically, like, I can't give you one answer. I know you want one answer for which is the hardest, but it's really not doable. So just remember, and also remember, this is from the perspective in English speak. Imagine how English would probably be difficult to learn from the perspective of someone from the Canary Islands or whatever. So because languages, and it's interesting, because languages are harder the more different they are from English, it's also harder to compare them, because as they get further away from English, they also get further away from each other. Imagine they're going away from English but in separate directions, so they're also far away from each other. They might actually have more common in English than with each other. That is why it is so difficult to compare them. So I hope this video has shown you a little bit more about them. But yeah, it is truly a difficult question. I hope I've done the best in answering it by educating you so you can have your own answer, and I hope you enjoyed. Thank you.